Harlem, Saturday, March the 16th, 1929. 9:41 p.m. A private dining room above an Italian social club on East 116th Street. The kind of place that smelled like cigar smoke, garlic, and expensive fear. 2 guards stood outside the door like statues. Inside, the table was long and narrow, set with untouched plates. No one came here to eat. They came here to decide who was allowed to breathe in New York. At the center sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, calm as stone, hat still on, coat still on. Because in rooms like this, taking your coat off meant you believed you were safe. Across from him sat 3 Italian men in tailored suits. One of them wasn't like the others. He was younger. Loud eyes, restless hands. And he wore arrogance the way some men wore cologne. His name was Frank Capone, Al Capone's brother. The meeting had one purpose: money roots. And the Harlem numbers runners were cutting through Italian liquor paths. Everyone was losing something, and when gangsters lose something, they start counting bodies. This was supposed to end with a clean agreement. But Frank Capone didn't come for agreement. He came to make a point. He leaned back, glanced at Bumpy like he was inspecting an animal, and smiled with no warmth. "So this is him," Frank said, in a voice meant to be heard. "This is Harlem's big shot." Bumpy didn't blink. Frank turned to the older Italian beside him as if Bumpy wasn't even in the room. "I expected bigger." He let the words hang, then added slowly with deliberate disgust, "Looks like a man who should be carrying my bags." One of Bumpy's men, Royce Whitaker, tensed so hard his chair creaked. Royce was young, sharp, hungry, Harlem-born. A fighter trying to become more than a fighter. And tonight, he wasn't just guarding Bumpy. He was guarding the only man who'd ever pulled him out of the gutter. Because Royce had a problem nobody at this table knew. His mother was dying in a cold apartment 3 blocks away. The doctor wanted cash up front. The landlord wanted rent. His little sister hadn't eaten since morning. Royce had taken this job because Bumpy promised him one thing: stay close, and your family stays alive. So when Frank Capone spoke like that, like Bumpy was nothing, Royce felt rage rise like fire up a chimney. But it wasn't Royce's job to talk. It was his job to keep Bumpy alive. Frank's smile widened as he watched Bumpy, waiting for flinch, for anger, for a man to crack. Instead, Bumpy lifted his glass and took a small sip, like the insult wasn't even worth swallowing. That made Frank furious. "You don't speak?" Frank asked. "You can't speak? Or you're not allowed?" Bumpy finally turned his eyes fully toward him. Quiet. Controlled. "Say what you came to say," Bumpy replied. Frank laughed under his breath. "Oh, I will." Then, without warning, Frank reached into his jacket and tossed something onto the table. It clattered against the plates. A small folded paper. A list of names. The older Italian stared at it. Bumpy didn't move. Frank tapped the list with one finger. "Those are your runners," Frank said. "The ones stepping where they don't belong." Then he slid a silver lighter across the table like it was an offer. "Here's the deal, Johnson. You call them off tonight or tomorrow. Harlem learns what happens when it bites the hand that feeds the city." A heavy silence swallowed the room. Royce glanced at the list and his stomach tightened. Because he recognized 2 names. One of them was his cousin, the other was the landlord who held his mother's medicine hostage. Frank Capone wasn't negotiating, he was setting a trap. And Bumpy Johnson, without raising his voice, pushed the lighter back toward Frank. "No," Bumpy said. Frank's eyes sharpened instantly. "You sure you want to say that in front of witnesses?" Frank asked, the smile gone now. Bumpy leaned forward slightly, just enough for everyone to feel the shift. I'm sure, he said. Frank stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor like a blade coming out of a sheath. Then you just signed the death papers, Frank whispered. And that's when the older Italian on Frank's left, a man who hadn't spoken once, quietly opened his coat. Royce saw the metal first. A gun. Not pulled out fast. Not dramatic. Already halfway out. Meaning, it wasn't for later. It was for right now. Royce's heart hammered. Bumpy didn't even look at the weapon. He looked at Frank Capone and asked, almost politely, Frank, did your brother know you were coming here to die tonight? Frank froze. Because that wasn't a threat. It sounded like a fact. And outside the door, a sudden thud echoed in the hallway, like a body hitting the floor, then another, then silence. Royce's hand slid toward his own gun as the doorknob slowly began to turn from the outside. Who was coming in? And were they coming to save them? Or finish them? Same night. 9:43 p.m. The doorknob turned like it had all the time in the world. Royce Whitaker's fingers tightened around the grip of his pistol under the table, so hard the wood bit into his palm. He didn't raise it yet. Raising it too early meant panic. Panic meant bullets flying the wrong direction. Across from him, Frank Capone stood frozen, jaw clenched, eyes sharp, trying to decide if Bumpy's calm was an act or a warning. Because Bumpy Johnson still hadn't moved. He sat there like the room belonged to him. Like the gun half sliding from the Italian's coat was a boring detail. And that terrified everyone more than shouting ever could. The door opened. A man stepped in, thin, slick-haired, breathing hard. Not one of the Italian guards, one of theirs. Leon Lenny Bryce, Bumpy's messenger. His cheek was split. Blood ran down his chin. His suit collar was ripped like someone had grabbed him and tried to drag him backward through the hallway. Lenny looked around the room and swallowed. They're outside, he said. Royce felt his stomach drop. Frank Capone's face didn't change, but his eyes did. The slightest flicker of satisfaction. Bumpy didn't even ask who. He already knew. How many? Bumpy asked. Lenny's voice shook. A lot. The older Italian men at the table exchanged a quick look. One of them reached toward his coat again, more confident now, like the plan was finally arriving on schedule. That's when Bumpy turned his head, slowly, and looked at Royce for the first time tonight. Not with fear, with instruction. Royce understood immediately. Don't start it in here. Because the room was a coffin. One wrong move and everyone inside would die in it. Royce's mind raced. But under that thinking, there was another pressure. Hotter, more personal. His mother, Mary Whitaker, sick and coughing blood into rags in a freezing apartment. His kid sister, Estelle, sitting close to the stove that didn't work, trying to warm her hands over nothing. Royce had promised them he'd bring money home tonight. But the money was in this room, and now this room might turn into a massacre. Royce wasn't just fighting for Bumpy's life. He was fighting for the fragile, miserable thread keeping his family from disappearing. Bumpy's voice stayed calm, cutting through the tension. Lenny, he said. Was anyone behind you when you came in? Lenny hesitated too long. Royce caught it. Bumpy caught it too. And suddenly Royce understood what Bumpy was really asking. Did you lead them here? Or did they send you ahead to unlock the door? Lenny's eyes flicked to Royce for a split second, like he was begging him to understand. No, Lenny said quickly. Nobody behind me. Frank Capone smiled again. "See," Frank said softly, "nobody's behind him." Then he glanced at the Italian who'd been reaching for the gun. Because Frank had wanted this moment. He'd wanted to humiliate Bumpy first, make him small, then destroy him. But Bumpy didn't look destroyed. He looked almost disappointed, like he'd expected better. Bumpy leaned slightly toward Lenny. "What happened in the hall?" he asked. Lenny swallowed hard. I heard a struggle. 2 men, I ran." Royce's stomach twisted. 2 men, 2 thuds. Bumpy had called it already, bodies in the hallway, but whose bodies? Royce forced himself to breathe. He couldn't let emotion turn him into a stupid man in a smart man's war. Bumpy's eyes stayed on Lenny. "You're shaking," Bumpy said. "It's cold," Lenny replied too fast. Royce's blood turned to ice. That wasn't cold shaking. That was guilt shaking. Because Royce knew Lenny's story. Everyone did. Lenny wasn't a gangster. Not really. He used to be a church boy until his father got crushed in a factory accident and the church passed around sympathy instead of rent money. Then Lenny learned the truth about kindness. It didn't keep the lights on. He started running messages for Bumpy because it paid, and it paid enough that he could keep his wife alive. His wife, Della Bryce, was pregnant. 8 months. And the doctor had already said the birth could be dangerous. Lenny was terrified of 2 things: dying in the street, leaving Della alone with nothing. So when men like Frank Capone made offers, money, protection, Lenny became the type of man who might do the wrong thing for the right reason. Royce realized something else too. If Lenny had been turned, it wasn't because he wanted status, it was because he was desperate. And desperate men break in ways loyal men never understand. Bumpy finally nodded, as if he'd already reached a conclusion. Then he spoke to Frank Capone. Voice smooth. "You came here to insult me," Bumpy said, "but you didn't come here alone." Frank's smile tightened. "No, I came here prepared." "Prepared," Bumpy repeated. "That's a clean word for betrayal." Frank leaned forward, eyes glittering. "Betrayal is what happens when you forget your place." Royce's jaw clenched. But Bumpy didn't react with anger. He reacted with something colder. He turned to the older Italian men. "You boys planning to shoot me in front of the Capone name?" he asked. The Italian with the gun didn't answer. He just pulled the weapon another inch. And in that fraction of a second, Royce saw the future. Gunfire. Blood. Smoke. Royce dying in a room his mother would never know the name of. So Royce did the only thing he could do. He leaned toward Bumpy and whispered, barely moving his lips, "Boss, tell me now." Bumpy didn't look at him. But his reply came instantly. Quiet, clear, final. "They already chose tonight," Bumpy murmured, "so we choose how it ends." And outside the room, footsteps swelled down the hallway, fast, heavy, many, coming closer, coming to the door. Royce's mouth went dry. Because whoever was out there wasn't coming to talk. They were coming to erase everyone inside. And Lenny Bryce was standing between them and the lock. 9:45 p.m. The footsteps outside weren't casual. They weren't guards making rounds. They were the hard, synchronized steps of men who had already decided the ending. Royce Whitaker counted them by sound. 4, 6, 8, too many. The Italian across the table finally drew his gun fully now, laying it low beside his thigh like it was polite silverware. Frank Capone didn't sit back down. He stood with the smug stillness of a man who believed the world was rigged in his favor. Because it was. At least, most nights. Bumpy looked at the door, then back at Frank. "You picked a nice room," Bumpy said calmly. "Small. Only one exit." Frank's mouth curled. "You noticed?" Bumpy nodded once, like a teacher acknowledging a student's work. Then Bumpy turned his eyes to Royce. Just a flick. Royce understood. Time to move people. Royce pushed back his chair slightly, as if he needed air, as if nerves were getting to him. He let his knees angle toward the side of the table where Lenny stood. Lenny Bryce still hadn't moved from the doorway. His chest rose and fell like he'd been sprinting for his life. But he wasn't afraid of the Italians. He was afraid of what was about to walk through that door. Royce leaned toward him in a whisper. "Lenny," he said, soft as smoke, "who did you bring here?" Lenny's eyes darted. "Nobody," he breathed. Royce stared harder. "Don't lie to me in a room full of men with guns." Lenny swallowed. His gaze flicked to Frank Capone. And that was all the answer Royce needed. Royce felt fury spike in his ribs, but he swallowed it down. Anger was a luxury. Not tonight. Because Royce wasn't just fighting for pride. He was fighting for time. Time meant survival. Time meant getting home with cash for his mother. Time meant Estelle eating something tomorrow besides water. Royce shifted closer to Bumpy. "Boss," he murmured, "we can't let them open that door." Bumpy didn't move his head. "We won't." "How?" Royce asked. Bumpy finally turned his eyes back to Frank and spoke like he was offering one last chance for mercy. "Frank," Bumpy said, "call them off." Frank laughed quietly, shaking his head like Bumpy had become entertainment. "You don't get it," Frank said. "You don't call anything. You don't stop anything. Harlem survives because we allow it." Bumpy's voice stayed even. "No. Harlem survives because men like you don't understand it." Frank's face darkened. There it is. The speech. Bumpy ignored him, eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not giving you a speech," Bumpy said. "I'm giving you a warning." Frank leaned forward, teeth showing now. "Then warn me." Bumpy's eyes went to Lenny, then back to Frank. And Bumpy said something that sliced through the room like a razor. "You think you brought the right men." Frank's smile flickered. Bumpy continued, slow and deliberate. "But you brought them to the wrong door." Silence. The footsteps outside stopped, right in front of the room. Royce's heart slammed. Bumpy stayed still. Frank's eyes tightened. Then there was a knock. Not the polite knock of a waiter. A firm, hard knock, like the final tap on a coffin. The older Italian men tensed. One lifted his chin toward the door. Frank Capone didn't answer. He didn't need to. His people were here. But Bumpy spoke first. "Come," Bumpy said. Frank snapped, "Don't." Too late. The door swung open and Royce's mind went cold, because the men in the hallway weren't Italians. They weren't Capone's soldiers. They were something else. 3 men in dark coats, hats low, faces half-shadowed. The one in front held a shotgun like it was a walking stick. He took one slow step into the room and looked directly at Frank Capone. Not at Bumpy. At Frank. Frank's confident posture stiffened. He recognized that face. Everyone did, if they lived long enough in New York to learn the names that mattered. Salvatore Salvi Amato, a Sicilian hitter with allegiance to nobody except money and vengeance. A man who didn't kill out of anger. He killed out of routine. Frank's voice came out sharper than he meant it to. "What the hell is this?" Frank demanded. Salvi Amato didn't answer him immediately. He scanned the table, saw the Italian delegates, saw the guns, saw Bumpy sitting like a king. Then Salvi spoke, voice flat. "Frank Capone," Salvi said. You're standing in my way. Frank blinked once. You work for my brother, Frank said. Salvi's eyes didn't change. I work for whoever paid me last. That was the moment Frank's confidence cracked. Royce saw it, clean and unmistakable. Frank had planned to kill Bumpy tonight. But the men at the door weren't here to kill Bumpy. They were here to kill Frank. The older Italians at the table exchanged panicked looks. One of them hissed, "This wasn't the plan." Salvi lifted the shotgun slightly, warning without words. Then Salvi looked at Bumpy and nodded. Not respectful, but acknowledging something like this meeting had been arranged. Royce's breath caught. He turned his eyes to Bumpy, barely believing what he was seeing. Bumpy's face remained calm, unreadable. But his eyes looked like a man who had already walked this road in his head 100 times. Royce's mind raced. If Bumpy called Salvi here, that meant Bumpy knew Frank was coming. Bumpy knew the insult would happen. Bumpy knew the trap, which meant Bumpy let it happen anyway. Frank's voice rose, panic leaking into it now. "Johnson!" Frank snapped. "What is this? What did you do?" Bumpy finally stood for the first time. Not fast, not dramatic. He stood with the weight of certainty. Then he spoke. Quiet. Calm. Deadly. "I gave you a chance to leave," Bumpy said. "You wanted witnesses." He looked around the table. "Now you have them." Frank's face went pale. He stepped back instinctively toward the door, but Salvi's men shifted to block him like a wall forming. Royce felt the room tilt into chaos, because now it wasn't Bumpy versus Capone's brother. Now it was Bumpy versus history. And Royce realized the moral trap tightening around him. If Frank Capone died here tonight, Al Capone would come for Harlem like a storm. And Royce's mother, his sister, everyone he loved, they'd be the first ones burned alive for revenge. Frank Capone stared at Bumpy, voice trembling with fury. "You kill me here," Frank whispered, "and my brother will turn this city into a graveyard." Bumpy stepped closer, eyes locked. "Then tell your brother," Bumpy said, "to bring a shovel." And Salvi Amato raised the shotgun. Royce's blood ran cold because he noticed something else now. Lenny Bryce was sweating, and his hand was sliding into his coat. Not for a gun, for something smaller, something with a wire. Royce's eyes widened, because in Lenny's shaking fingers was a detonator. 9:47 p.m. The room held its breath. Salvi Amato's shotgun was aimed at Frank Capone's chest. The barrel didn't tremble. Men like Salvi didn't shake. They ended things. Frank Capone backed up until his spine met the wall. His mouth opened, maybe to threaten, maybe to plead. But no sound came out. His eyes were locked on that shotgun like it was the only truth left in the world. And then Royce saw it. Lenny Bryce's hand inside his coat, not reaching for a pistol, reaching for something smaller. Royce's pulse slammed against his skull as he stepped sideways, subtle, silent, until he could see clearly. A small metal switch, a wire. A sweating thumb hovering over the trigger, a detonator. Royce's stomach turned to ice. This wasn't just a hit. This was a wipeout. Frank Capone hadn't come here to shoot Bumpy and leave. He'd come here to bury everyone, Bumpy, his men, the Italians at the table, so no one could say who started it. A clean story for tomorrow's newspapers? Gang meeting turns deadly, unknown attackers. Royce's mind raced so fast it burned. If Lenny triggered that device, it wouldn't matter who won this gunfight. Everyone would die, including Royce. And the money he needed for his mother's last chance at survival. Royce snapped his eyes to Bumpy. Bumpy was watching Lenny too. So Bumpy already knew. Which meant Bumpy had let Lenny come into the room carrying a detonator. Royce almost couldn't believe it, until he realized what Bumpy had done. Bumpy didn't just anticipate the insult. He anticipated the method. He had built the room into a trap for the trapper. Frank Capone was still staring at Salvi, still thinking his worst problem was a shotgun. He didn't know his own man was holding a switch that could erase them all. Royce wanted to shout, but shouting would make Lenny squeeze. So Royce moved carefully, his hand slowly drifting toward his gun, but not drawing. Not yet. He locked eyes with Lenny, hard. Lenny's face was shiny with sweat. His lips trembled. His eyes were red like he'd been crying for hours. Royce recognized that look. That wasn't the look of a confident traitor. That was the look of a man who'd been cornered by fate. Bumpy's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Lenny," Bumpy said softly. Lenny froze. Bumpy took one slow step toward him. Not aggressive, almost gentle. "You got your wife at home," Bumpy continued. "Della." Lenny flinched like he'd been slapped. Royce's throat tightened. Bumpy wasn't guessing. Bumpy knew. Bumpy knew exactly what pressure Frank Capone had applied. Frank's eyes snapped to Lenny. "What is he talking about?" Frank demanded. Lenny didn't answer. His thumb hovered, shaking now, over the detonator trigger. Royce felt panic claw up his spine. One twitch, one mistake, and the whole block would turn into smoke. Bumpy raised a hand, not to threaten but to calm. "Listen to me," Bumpy said, voice low and controlled. "You're not a killer, Lenny." Frank barked a laugh, forced, ugly. "Oh, he's a killer," Frank snapped. "He's just smart enough to do it properly." Bumpy ignored Frank. Bumpy stared at Lenny like he was looking straight through him. "They told you they'd hurt Della," Bumpy said, "if you didn't do this." Lenny's eyes filled, his jaw clenched so tight it shook. "Don't," Lenny whispered. "Don't say her name." That was the confession. Frank's face hardened. "Do it," he ordered, voice sharp. "Do it now." Lenny trembled. Royce saw the moment Lenny became dangerous, because the worst men weren't bold men. The worst men were terrified men who felt they had nothing left. Royce took another half step closer, trying to angle himself for a clean shot if needed. One bullet through Lenny's wrist stopped the trigger. But Bumpy spoke again, and his words made Royce freeze. "Frank," Bumpy said calmly, "you still don't understand what's happening." Frank snapped his head. "Shut up." Bumpy's eyes didn't blink. "You think you're the one holding Harlem hostage," Bumpy said, "but tonight, you walked into a room where nobody needed you alive." Frank's nostrils flared. "You're dead. You're all dead." Salvi Amato's shotgun lifted higher, and for the first time, Salvi spoke directly to Frank like Frank was already a ghost. "They paid for certainty," Salvi said, "not for drama." Frank's face twisted in disbelief. "Who paid you?" Frank demanded. Salvi didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the answer was in the room. One of the older Italian delegates, Vito Lancelotti, a respected negotiator, looked sick. His hands were gripping the table so tight his knuckles went white. Frank turned and stared at him. "Vito," Frank said slowly. "You?" Vito's mouth opened, but no words came. That's when Frank understood. Not just betrayal, a mafia internal betrayal. Someone inside the Italian side wanted Frank Capone gone before he started a war they couldn't control. Frank's chest rose and fell fast now. His confidence was gone. This wasn't a meeting anymore. It was an execution with paperwork already signed. Royce's mind flashed. Frank dies. Al Capone blames Harlem. Retaliation. Royce felt sick, because if Bumpy allowed this, Bumpy was choosing war, but then Bumpy made his real move. He didn't order Salvi to fire. He turned fully to Lenny Bryce and lowered his voice like a father talking to a scared son. "Lenny," Bumpy said, "I can save Della tonight, right now." Lenny's eyes snapped up, hope and terror colliding. Frank shouted, "No!" Bumpy held Lenny's gaze. "You think Capone will protect her?" Bumpy asked. "If you fail here, you think they'll keep their word?" "They'll kill her because you know too much." Lenny's breathing turned ragged. Royce saw the shift, the truth landing. Frank's threats only worked as long as Lenny believed obedience meant safety. But now Bumpy was showing him the real math. Obedience meant death later. Refusal meant death now. Only one option offered even a thin chance. Bumpy took one more step, close enough that Royce could see every detail of Lenny's shaking thumb. Bumpy spoke softer, sharper. "Give it to me," Bumpy said, "and I swear on my life, you'll see your child born." Lenny's eyes spilled tears. His thumb hovered, and then a gunshot cracked like lightning. Royce flinched violently, not from his side, from the doorway. One of Salvi's men had fired fast, aiming not at Lenny's hand, but at his chest. The bullet hit Lenny high in the shoulder, spinning him backward, and for a split second, Royce saw the worst thing imaginable. Lenny fell, and his thumb pressed down. Royce shouted, "No!" But the explosion didn't come. Instead, there was a click, a dead click. Nothing happened. Bumpy's eyes snapped to the detonator, then to Frank Capone. And Bumpy smiled for the first time tonight. Not a warm smile, a cold one. Because the twist wasn't just that Lenny had a detonator. The twist was the detonator was never real. Royce saw it now, a fake, a prop, a psychological weapon. Lenny had been terrified, holding a switch that wasn't connected to anything. Frank Capone had built a bluff, and Bumpy had known it. Frank's face went pale in horror. "You," Frank stammered, "you tricked him?" Bumpy stepped over the fallen Lenny, picked up the small device, and casually snapped it open. Empty. No wiring inside, no charge connection, nothing. Just fear in metal form. Royce felt his breath return, shaky, furious relief. And then Bumpy turned toward Frank with that same calm certainty. "You brought a toy into a room full of real men," Bumpy said. Frank's mouth opened, desperation cracking through. "You can't kill me," Frank whispered. "You can't." "My brother." Bumpy cut him off, voice ice cold. "You should have brought your brother then." Salvi Amato's shotgun moved closer. Royce's brain screamed, "If Frank dies, war comes." He looked at Bumpy, pleading without words, but Bumpy's eyes showed no uncertainty. Then Frank did something unexpected. He lunged, not toward the door, toward Royce. Frank grabbed Royce's collar and yanked him backward, pistol appearing in Frank's hand like it had been hidden in his soul. He jammed the gun against Royce's throat. Royce's body locked in shock. Frank shouted, voice breaking, "Back off, or I open his neck." Salvi's men froze. The Italians at the table went rigid. Bumpy's face didn't change, but Royce saw something flare deep in his eyes. Because Frank Capone had just made the worst possible choice. He didn't take Bumpy hostage. He took Royce, the one man Bumpy trusted with his back. Frank's eyes were wild now, desperate. "You kill me," Frank hissed at Bumpy, "and you watch him die first." Royce swallowed hard, feeling the cold kiss of metal at his throat. His hands hovered, unable to move without triggering his own death. Bumpy stepped forward slowly, voice dangerously quiet. "Frank," Bumpy said, "you don't know what you just grabbed." And Royce realized something even darker. Bumpy wasn't afraid Royce would die. Bumpy was deciding whether Royce's life was worth sparing Frank Capone. 9:49 p.m. Frank Capone's pistol dug into Royce Whitaker's throat, hard enough to steal his breath. Royce could smell Frank's sweat, sharp, desperate. This wasn't a man with a plan anymore. This was a man trying to bargain with gravity. "Tell them to move," Frank whispered into Royce's ear. "Tell them or you die." Royce didn't speak, because Royce knew something Frank didn't. Bumpy Johnson didn't make choices based on pressure. He made choices based on outcomes. And in Bumpy's world, love was real, but survival was law. Bumpy took one slow step closer. His voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "Royce," Bumpy said, "look at me." Royce's eyes shifted, careful. Bumpy's face was steady, no panic, no pleading, just control. That steadiness hit Royce in the chest like a punch, because it told Royce the truth. Bumpy was thinking, not reacting. Frank jerked Royce tighter, muzzle pressing in. "I'll do it," Frank barked at the room. "I swear I'll do it." Salvi Amato's shotgun stayed aimed, waiting. The older Italian delegate, Vito Lancelotti, looked like he was about to faint. He understood what Frank didn't. Hostage tricks worked in street robberies, not in rooms where decisions were already signed. Bumpy's eyes stayed locked on Frank. "You want to trade?" Bumpy said. "Fine." Frank blinked, hope flashing. Bumpy's hand moved slowly into his coat. Royce's heart stopped. Frank shoved the gun deeper into Royce's neck. "Careful." Bumpy drew out a folded envelope and held it up between two fingers. Frank frowned. "What is that?" Bumpy's voice was quiet. "Proof," he said. "A wire transcript, names, dates, payments, your brother's men in New York, your brother's liquor routes, all of it." The room went still. Even Salvi's men leaned forward slightly, instinctively. Bumpy continued, calm as a priest delivering confession. "If I die here, that envelope goes to every enemy Al Capone has ever made," Bumpy said. "In Chicago, in New York, in places you've never heard of." Frank's grip faltered for a fraction of a second. He believed it, because Bumpy didn't bluff. Frank swallowed. "Give it to me." Bumpy nodded once. "I will," he said, "when you drop the gun." Frank's eyes flicked, torn between rage and survival. Royce felt the tremor in Frank's arm, the moment his courage cracked. Frank had come here to dominate. Now he was begging for the right to leave alive. But as Frank hesitated, something else happened. Lenny Bryce, bleeding on the floor, coughed. A wet, ugly sound. Royce glanced down and saw Lenny's eyes locked on him, filled with regret, fear, and something like apology. Lenny's lips moved. Royce barely heard the whisper, "Stella." That single word tore Royce in half, because in that moment Royce realized the moral cost. Lenny wasn't evil, he was broken. And now he would die broken. Bumpy looked down at Lenny, expression tightening just slightly. Then Bumpy looked back at Frank. "Last chance," Bumpy said. Frank's breath came fast. He loosened the gun just a little. Royce felt the pressure at his throat ease. And that's when Salvi Amato fired. Not at Frank, at Frank's gun hand. The blast shattered Frank's wrist with a brutal snap. Frank screamed as the pistol flew away across the floor. Royce surged forward, ripping free, stumbling into open air like a man waking from drowning. Frank fell back, clutching his ruined wrist, face twisted in agony. Bumpy stepped toward him, Frank looked up, eyes full of hate and terror. "You'll burn for this," Frank wheezed. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. "You came to burn Harlem," Bumpy replied. "So you'll leave with ashes in your mouth?" Royce stood shaking, alive, but not whole, because Lenny was still on the floor bleeding out. And Royce knew what came next. Frank Capone wouldn't die quietly, and Al Capone wouldn't forgive. Bumpy turned slightly, eyes scanning the room like a judge. Tonight they survived. But the price wasn't paid yet. It was coming. Harlem, 11:12 p.m. News didn't travel in Harlem like it did downtown. It didn't move through newspapers first. It moved through whispers, through doorways, through the way men stopped talking when someone new entered a room. By the time the first police siren echoed down Lenox Avenue, everyone already knew something terrible had happened on East 116th Street. Not the details. Not yet. But the feeling, that old, familiar tightening in the city's chest. The sense that a line had just been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Royce Whitaker walked 3 blocks like a man carrying a second heartbeat that didn't belong to him. Blood still dotted his collar where Frank Capone's pistol had pressed. His hands shook in short bursts, like the fear was leaving in pieces. Bumpy stayed beside him, silent, not comforting, not apologizing. Bumpy didn't do those things in public. But Royce noticed something that mattered. Bumpy never left his side. They turned onto a side street behind a closed jazz bar. A black Packard waited there, engine running low. 2 of Bumpy's men stood guard, eyes scanning the street. Inside the car, someone was already sitting. Royce tensed instinctively, hand moving toward his gun. Then the man leaned forward into the dim light. Vito Lancelotti, one of the Italian delegates. The one who had silently betrayed Frank Capone. Royce's jaw tightened. He wanted to drag Vito out of the car and throw him into the gutter. But Bumpy held up one hand. "Stop." Vito's face was pale. He looked older than he had 2 hours earlier. "You didn't have to do it like that," Vito said, voice strained. Bumpy didn't blink. "Yes," Bumpy replied. "I did." Vito swallowed hard. "You understand what happens now," Vito whispered. Bumpy's voice stayed calm, but it was iron underneath. "Yes," he said. "Al Capone sends men." Royce felt his stomach turn again. Men, not 1, not 2, a wave. Vito leaned in closer, desperate. "It wasn't supposed to be loud," Vito said. "Frank was reckless. He was going to start a war anyway. I tried to remove him before." Bumpy cut him off with a cold glance. "You tried to remove him and leave Harlem holding the knife," Bumpy said. Vito's mouth opened, then closed. "Because it was true." Royce finally spoke, his voice rough. "My cousin's name was on that list," Royce said. "You knew that?" Vito's eyes dropped. "I didn't make the list." Royce leaned forward, rage breaking through his fear. "But you let it come into Harlem." Bumpy put one hand on Royce's shoulder, steady, grounding. Not softness, just control. Then Bumpy turned to Vito. "You're going to send word tonight," Bumpy said. "You're going to tell Chicago Frank acted alone. You're going to tell them New York didn't order it." Vito let out a hollow laugh, almost a sob. "They won't believe me." Bumpy leaned closer until Vito had no choice but to look at him. "Then you'll make them believe you," Bumpy said quietly. "Or you'll die trying." Vito's eyes widened. "You can't—" Bumpy interrupted him, voice low. "I can." Silence. Royce realized what Bumpy was doing now. This wasn't revenge. This was damage control. Bumpy was trying to contain the storm. But storms didn't care about strategy. They cared about blood. As Royce sat back, his mind flashed to Lenny Bryce bleeding on the floor. Lenny's wife, Della, not knowing her world had just collapsed. Royce swallowed hard. "What happens to Della?" Royce asked. Bumpy's eyes didn't move. "She'll be taken care of," Bumpy said. Royce studied him. It wasn't a promise spoken with warmth. It was a promise spoken with obligation, because Bumpy had offered Lenny salvation, and Lenny died anyway. Moral cost. Then, from the front seat, one of Bumpy's drivers turned slightly. "Boss," the driver said, "we got word." Bumpy's face didn't change, but the air shifted. "What word?" Bumpy asked. The driver hesitated. "Chicago's already moving," he said. "They heard Frank got hit. They think you ordered it." Royce's throat tightened. Bumpy nodded slowly, absorbing it like cold rain. Then Bumpy said something that made Royce's blood run colder than the winter air outside. "Then Harlem becomes a battlefield." Royce stared at him. Not because he doubted Bumpy, but because he understood what it meant. This wasn't the end of the night. It was the beginning of the next one. And somewhere in Chicago, Al Capone was about to learn his brother had been crippled, humiliated by a man he'd never forgiven for breathing. Royce's hands clenched into fists. Because if Capone came to Harlem, Royce's family would be in the path first. Bumpy looked out the window at Harlem's dark streets, then spoke without emotion. "Get your mother and sister out tonight." Royce turned sharply. "What?" Bumpy's eyes stayed forward. "Because when Capone strikes," Bumpy said, "he doesn't aim at kings." He finally glanced at Royce. "He aims at families." And Royce understood with a sick dread. The war wasn't going to start with Bumpy. It was going to start with Royce's front door. Harlem checked. Sunday, March 17th, 1929. 2:06 a.m. Royce didn't go home, not first, because going home meant leading death to his mother's door. Instead, he took the back routes, alleys, service entrances, the quiet spine of Harlem where only the desperate stayed awake. Bumpy's car stopped outside a small clinic that didn't advertise. No sign, no front light. Just a locked door and a man with tired eyes who recognized Bumpy immediately. Royce stepped out, shaking. "What are we doing here?" he asked. Bumpy looked at him once. "Paying debt." Inside, the hallway smelled of disinfectant and old grief. Royce followed Bumpy to a dim room where a single lamp glowed, and there, on a narrow bed wrapped in clean sheets, Della Bryce, 8 months pregnant, eyes swollen from crying, hands clenched around her belly like she was holding her whole future together. Royce froze. Because beside her bed sat a doctor, and beside the doctor sat Lenny Bryce's wallet, opened, empty. Della looked up and saw Royce. Her voice cracked. "Where's my husband?" Royce's mouth opened, but no words came. Bumpy stepped forward and placed a thick envelope on the bedside table. Enough money to cover the birth, enough to cover rent, enough to keep hunger away for a while. But money couldn't bring back the man who earned it with betrayal and fear. Della stared at the envelope like it was poison. Then she whispered, so quiet it barely existed. "He didn't do it for himself, did he?" Royce swallowed, throat burning. Bumpy answered with a truth that felt like punishment. "No," Bumpy said. "He did it so you'd live." Della broke, silent tears, shaking shoulders. Royce stepped back, sick with the irony. Frank Capone survived. Lenny died. And the one person least guilty, Della, paid the heaviest emotional cost. As they walked out, Royce finally asked the question that haunted him. Boss, I just, was tonight worth it? Bumpy didn't turn around. He only said, "You'll find out when the bullets start hitting houses instead of men."